Israel Noletto on Brave New World's literary glossopoesis as a narrative framework in science fiction. It is all yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm Israel Noletto. I am a Galanga as well, like yourselves. I've been constructing Fürsch, Aufrisch, and Ningata for a while, but today I'll be presenting a portion of my doctoral thesis. This is an ongoing research, so comments and thoughts, as well as criticism, are most welcome. I'll leave my email address at the end of the presentation if you want to get in touch and say a few words about what you thought. You'll be welcome. So the premise of my research is that Glossopoesis can and is used as a narrative tool, not only in science fiction texts, of course, but in order to limit my scope, both here in this short presentation and in my research, I've decided to focus on science fictional texts and its closest causing dystopia, which is regarded by some as a subgenre of science fiction due to its concerns with the future of humanity and its social relations with power and technology. Well, that aside, I'd like to go through a few definitions just so we're on the same page here. First, what I mean when I say literary Glossopoesis, any use of a constructed fictional language in a work of fiction. And that includes fully-fledged conlangs, sketch conlangs, conceptual conlangs, and naming conlangs. Having said that, what do I mean when I say narrative framework? Well, first, narrative refers to a story being told. It is the account of events, experiences, and details. A narrative framework underlies the manner in which a narrative is presented to a reader. It also entails the layers of narrative that are presented in a work of fiction. Some types of narrative frameworks include linear, non-linear, embedded, and secular. And embedded is of special relevance to my research. Well, embedded narratives means one or more secondary or ancillary narratives within a surface narrative, also known as framing narratives. They may be simple or complex, short or long. We all know some stories that contain shorter narratives within it. For instance, 1001 Nights, in which Scheherazade has to tell the king a different story every night to escape death. Every story she tells the king is an embedded narrative. There are many techniques used to include embedded narratives in a story. And maybe a character's flashback, a parallel plot, illustrations, pictures, maps, etc., and also conlangs. While the model created by 1001 Nights does not require that the embedded narratives bear any connection with the main narrative, the use of conlangs certainly does, and therefore I call secondary or ancillary narratives as they are not standalone narratives. They can add depth, additional layers, and immersion to a story, have a great power to carry embedded information. And it happens that natural languages as well have a great power and great potential to carry embedded history. If we look, for example, at the word health in English, it comes from an Old English word health, which means wholeness, being whole, complete, also originated the word whole. The same root also originated a number of other words in other Germanic languages. For example, in Dutch, it originated heil, which means whole, and heilig, which means holy. And in Norwegian, hilly, and in Danish, hil and hilly, and also in Swedish, heila and heilig. In German, it originated, the word for whole and wholeness originated from a different root. In German, it's ganz and Gesamtheit. If we look at the word, the Greek word for health, eugeia, we can see something similar. Before advancing to the Greek word, a short comment on the history these words in Germanic languages can carry. Well, history tells us that the Germanic peoples were often occupied with war, not having many peace periods, either in war among themselves or against the Romans. So it is only natural to think of health as the state of being whole, complete, not missing any limbs, a hand, an arm, or a leg due to fierce battles. So in addition to that, the Greek word for health, eugeia, that originates from the Greek goddess Eugeia, probably pronounced like that in ancient Greek. It comes from the name of the goddess, and the anglicized pronunciation is Hygia. Basically, being healthy for the Greeks, or having good health, then meant being blessed by Hygia, which is a neat way to reflect the Greek culture. They relied on mythology to explain pretty much everything around them. So the word reflected that. The belief that being healthy or having health was actually a blessing from the gods. The word was then imported into English and lost the cultural meaning charge, of course. But if we look at the etymology of it, we can still find that out. So in literary Glossopoesis, the same applies. For example, one of the earliest registers of literary Glossopoesis was by Hildegard von Bingen. She invented the lingua ignota sometime in the 1200s. After that, Thomas More in 1516 invented utopian, and he used the language. It was a naming language, and he used it in the work Utopia. And there is much for us to learn from the language when we analyze the text. Later on, Jonathan Swift invented several languages in 1726 to feature in his texts that later on were collected in Gulliver's Travels. And more recently, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake in 1939. There are, however, three more recent examples that I would like now to use to briefly demonstrate my premise that Glossopoesis in literature can be used as secondary or an ancillary framework. These novels are very well known, so especially by the knowledgeable audience in the conference today. So rather than making a plot summary, I'll go straight over the conlangs present in them, drawing a parallel with the narratives. So the novels are 1984 by George Orwell, Native Tongue by Suzette, Haden, Elgin, and Ursula, Guin, The Dispossessed. Well, first off, if we look into the language present in 1984, we can see a strong correlation with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. We know that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis indicated that the language someone speaks can not only influence, but determine the way one thinks. So this is an important feature in the Newspeak language. If we look, for example, at, we'll go through some examples of the language and see what they mean and how they were constructed. If we look, for example, at the first word, belly feel, this word, of course, it's very transparent that this is the connection of belly and feel. The word belly feel means a blind, enthusiastic acceptance of an idea. The party's doctrine becomes a gut instinct. By extension, we could say that the connection of belly and feel also gives the impression of being obedient, so that you don't have your bellies empty. The next example, prime think, which means having thoughts that are unorthodox or outside the official government platform. So basically, if someone has an idea and that idea goes against the party's ideology, that's a crime, and the name for that is crime think. And then duck speak. Duck speak literally means to quack like a duck, or to quack like a duck, or to speak without thinking. It can either be good or ungood, as the newspeak word is, depending on who is speaking and whether they are saying it following the ideals of the big brother. And then joy camp. Joy camp is a concentration camp, which is very similar to the idea that Nazis developed during the Nazi Germany, in which they would put up the message and welcoming a message to the Jews and other prisoners saying, Die Arbeit macht frei, which means work sets free. Of course, this is very far from truth, because according to the Nazis' plans, the Jews and the other prisoners were never to be set free, let alone by their work. They would actually go to die and starve because of the excessive word charge. But all these words follow the same philosophy, like fooling people into believing concepts by the exponents of the words. Belly feel, crime think, duck speak, joy camp all work under the same premise that you can idioticize people by changing the language they speak and by depriving them from enough vocabulary to have thoughts against your ideology. So we can see that the narrative about Winston Smith's dystopian future is told in traditional prose, but Ingsock's evil and totalitarianism relayed through the newspeak language. Newspeak tells an ancillary story of oppression even to the level of thoughts. Those who have already lived under such circumstances that their language was forbidden and they were forced to speak another one will establish a singular connection with that. The second example is Laden, which is featured in Native Tongue, written by Suzette, Haden, Elgin. Then again, the language bears a strong reliance on the Sapir Word hypothesis, because the creators of this language, which is constructed as well in the novel, it's considered constructed, it doesn't pretend to be a natural language in the novel, it is admittedly constructed. So they believed that by creating a new language that would reflect their own ideology, they would set the oppressed women of the future America free. So it was intended both as a secret language and as a way to influence thoughts of courage and rebellion. A few words that are included in the text, there are much more available on the web, dictionaries and the sort, but on the novel, a few words are made available. And some of them are very interesting to look at. For example, this first one, Shadhu, it means growth through transcendence, either of a person, a non-human, or thing, for example, an organization or a city or a sect. The other one, Ramimel, to refrain from asking with evil intent, especially when it is clear that someone badly wants the other to ask. And Wohosheni. The narrative on Nazareth and Michaela is told in traditional prose as well. But the women's cry for liberation through the learning and the production, the construction of the language, and reflected in the Latin words in the text is how the reader, the audience, has access to that beyond the narrative limits. And finally, last example is Pravik, featured in the novel The Dispossessed, written by Ursula K. Guin. Pravik again bears a stronger belief in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. An examination of the words provided by Ursula K. Guin in the text, in addition to a few translated sentences, shows us something quite interesting. For example, the word amar, it means associate, and is used as a gender-neutral term similar to brother or comrade. And then clegich, it is related to drudgery or uninspiring work. And nunchnibi, which means people who habitually evade work. And finally, the sentence don't egoize, which is not shown in the language, but it's rather presented already in English. Every time someone uses the language in a way like Western languages do, we have possession, and we have ways to express possession very easily in our languages, like words of as my and your, their, and so on. But in Pravik, that is not possible. So anytime someone would use the language in an innovative way to express that, people would look at that person and reprimand them by saying, don't egoize. So again, while the narrative on Shevik's journey to a dystopian world, the other planet, Eurus, is told in traditional prose, we can see that the Pravik language relays the ambiguity of the society that speaks it. As a matter of fact, the subtitle to the title, The Dispossessed, is an ambiguous utopia, and we can see that through the language. Note that the language was constructed to indoctrinate the people on the planet Anara's ideology. And as I argue, it also accounts for part of the ambiguity mentioned in the subtitle of the novel. The fact is that the language was constructed by a leader, and it was then enforced onto the people. The people then acted as thought police, surveilling over those who made a slip in regards to the ideology and reprimanding them. I find it quite interesting that although the three novels have an apparent difference in objective of their languages, they all end up doing the same thing. It serves, so establishing how the languages work in the plot serves us to pinpoint and to establish the understanding that all three novels agree with Sigmund Freud in the book Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, or Civilization, and it's discounted in English. Positions of power and oppression are unavoidable in human society. So in 1984, we see that the government is trying to oppress people and control their thoughts by obligating them to speak a new revised English. In native tongue, we see a group of women that are oppressed, and they create a new language, but the language is only created by a small group of linguists, and it is then enforced onto the other women from the top to the bottom, and they don't have, the other ones don't have any participation in the construction of the language. They just have to accept what is being taught. And then the language created, according to the premises of the world built, will then model the other women's thoughts. And the same happens on Anaris, which is, according to the text, supposedly an anarchy without any government. So people are free to behave or do as they please, when in reality, they, without the government, every single citizen is a policeman and a policewoman surveilling their neighbors as to check whether or not they are upholding the ideology. So it's very interesting to see how much the languages present in the texts can communicate to the reader who is interested enough to look for that. So this is, as I said, an ongoing research. I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. This is my email address. And I also have a profile on ResearchGate in case you want to read some of the papers I've already published on the subject. And here below, you can see some of the links to dictionaries of Newspeak, Haden, and Pravik, in case you want to check some of the words that do not show in the text, in the prose, but are added as glossaries or appendixes in the books. So this is it. If anyone is willing to leave a comment in the comment section, and Joseph will now relay them to me.
Thank you so much, Israel. There's lots of discussion happening in the YouTube chat that I definitely encourage you to take a look at once we get off this. There's I guess one PhD to another, we can appreciate that at a certain point you have to stop looking at new sources, or your PhD will never be finished. But there's lots of comments on other things you could look at if you were interested, different source materials. Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, the inspiration for the movie Arrival, of course. And there were a few others.
I have a few publications on that one specifically.
Brilliant. So there was one question from Matthew. Is there any truth to the idea that Orwell was parodying auxlangs with his newspeak?
Well, I wouldn't say there's any evidence to that, but there's reason to believe so. And he wouldn't be the first one to do so, actually. For example, if you look into Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, you see that there are a few sections in the texts that do exactly that. There's the Grand Academy of Legado, in which people would forget about creating words and then just carrying the objects on their backs. So whenever they would encounter someone who doesn't speak their languages, they would show the objects and would communicate by that. So of course, this is not feasible, because you would have to carry so much things on your back, you wouldn't be able to stand up and walk. So that's plain satire on the Ox languages that were emerging at the time. So I think there's evidence on Newspeak, because to some extent, what the government, what the party was doing was simplifying the language so that everyone would easily understand each other, but would also restrain their thoughts to what was upheld by the party. So everyone would understand each other very easily, because they wouldn't talk in depth. The conversations would be shallow, and it would be easy to understand. So the issues of universal communication, one way or another, would be solved. Unfortunately, by depriving people from speaking their minds.
There's excuse me. There's also a lot of commentary in YouTube about how the examples you chose are all languages created within the fiction quite purposefully. So it's not a language created for fiction that's just assumed to exist in the history of the world, but it's actually created within the fiction. Is that a particular theme that you're interested in exploring, or was that something that allowed you to separate which sources you investigated and things like that?
It is an interesting concept. There is another text that I've been working on, which traces the history of literary glossopoesis in English literature, in which I happen to make some mentions of already existing conlangs that were mentioned in literary texts. But these three were actually constructed to feature in the plots. And they're interesting because they are admittedly conlangs in the plots. They do not pretend to be natural languages in the plot. They are not pretending to be a country's language. Like, for example, Utopian. Utopian was the language of Utopia. And in these three texts, they are the three of them constructed to feature in the novels. And In addition, they all uphold the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis very closely, the strongest level of acceptance of the hypothesis. All of them believe that through language it's possible to control thoughts. And in actuality, we can see that language has some influence on how you understand what something says, because what you understand is the words in the language that are being talked back to you. But we know that if you destroy words, people are just going to come up with new vocabulary to the ideas they already have. But the thing is, the three novels work with very similar premises. This is one of the chapters of my doctoral thesis. So there are 2 more chapters dealing with other novels that work in similar ways as well. But these 3, they work in a very similar way, because either intentionally or not, the authors end up doing the same thing. A language is created on the top, and then it is enforced to the others on the bottom. And no matter what the reasons stated are for the creation of the languages, they are used as measures of control.
One question just came in from A. Walker Scott for your example, utopian, that you just gave. Isn't utopian a constructed language in the history of utopia as well?
No. In utopia, it is regarded as a natural language. It is the language, excuse me, it is the language spoken by the utopian people. When Raphael Hathloday visits Utopia, he is taken by surprise by the language they speak, which is described as being similar to Greek. And in reality, it is very similar to Greek, with some Latin influence and even Hebrew. And it has, in a way, it has some of the philosophy of NatLangs. It was, you can say, it was constructed to resemble natural languages and to have a very sense of phonosynthetics. It sounds very well because it is the roots of the languages. The language come from Greek and Latin, and those are very melodic languages.
Awesome, thank you very much. Like I said, definitely encourage you to pop over to the YouTube chat. There's lots of suggestions of other literary works you might want to consider, and a lot of engagement happening just around general conversation based on what you've been presenting.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure.